Do you remember COVID? Do you remember the lockdown? It was 2020 in May when we in Ireland were released from the first lockdown, and it seemed like the world had changed, like it'd never be back the way it was ever again. Of course, it went back. I wrote a little piece which I'd like to share with you, just to start with. Sometime around the lockdown, I met a man outside SuperValu as I was going in to buy groceries. He was standing at the doorway, staring at a dog that was sitting under the shopping trolleys. And if I wanted to retain appropriate social distance, then my access to the shop was blocked. But instead of asking him to get out of my way, I started up a conversation. "That's a grand mask you're wearing," I said. "I have no choice in the matter," he replied, "or so everyone tells me." "The government holds the same view," I said. "Yes," he agreed, "but can we believe the government? I heard somewhere that the virus was started by feeding dead orangutans to sick babies in order to turn us all into monkeys." "Where did you hear that?" I wondered. "It was on the internet," he said, and he looked as if he wasn't sure what the internet might be. I thought he was going to step out of the way, but he just changed the subject. "Isn't that a lovely dog?" he declared, and he appeared as happy as a clown in Duffy's circus, pointing at the little mutt underneath the stack of trolleys. "Do you think he wants me to get him a trolley so he can go in and shop?" the man wondered. Absurdity constitutes a large portion of conversation in rural Ireland. Country people are masters of the surreal. Reality itself is never tolerated. "I think he works for SuperValu," I suggested. "He counts the customers." When I got inside the shop eventually, I noticed a neighbour in the dairy aisle, and I bade him good morning. "Were you in an argument with the door?" he wondered. I didn't know what he was talking about until he pointed at my head. Then I remembered I had given myself a haircut the previous night. Cutting hair is the only masculine thing I do, although the beloved dreads the sight of me when the operation is done. I lock myself in my studio, strip naked, sit on a chair and take an electric hair clipper to the top of my head. Conducting the procedure while naked is the easiest way of avoiding hairs infiltrating my Harris tweeds. But I don't use a mirror because I have discovered from experience that it's impossible to shave behind the ears and watch myself in the mirror at the same time. So I prefer to work from memory, which is why there are often tufts as long as rushes growing behind the ears, driving many women insane, although not in a good way. To be honest, the only time I ever see my reflection is on a television screen, and even for me that's a disturbing experience. When I was young, I had such delicate locks of brown hair that men in certain discreet bars in the Midlands sometimes touched the top of my head fondly and wistfully. Those were days when Ireland was not free, when people went about in fear of moral police and intellectual fascists, a time when people had strong opinions about how others should live. A time when the gay community in particular was trapped in a lockdown of merciless self-righteousness that went by the name of Catholic Ireland. Literary bars were occasionally safe havens for men who needed to closet themselves away in dark snugs if they wanted to experience even the ordinary delicacies of love and intimacy that the rest of the population took for granted. I remember meeting men in that semi-literary world who were often married and had partners with whom they could never fully rejoice, and their nostalgia and self-loathing often resulted in a kind of poetic sentimentality that found oxygen in the world of literature and the privacy of snugs in public houses. "Jesus, Mary, and Saint Joseph," the woman at the checkout declared, looking at my shaven head, "I didn't recognize you without your wig." "That's the lockdown," I replied. "It makes monks of us all." And as I went out the door, my friend was still bent over the dog beneath the trolleys. "Be careful you don't give that dog COVID-19, I joked, continuing the surreal banter of our earlier encounter. But he looked at me with a kind of hurt, as if I were making fun of him. "I'm only trying to make friends," he said, and I walked away in shame, because it struck me that every lockdown still casts a merciless grip on the lonely heart. So I thought I would start with that because, in a sense, there's so much of me in this podcast which is about the need to confess, about the need to, not recognize that I am enlightened, not recognize, that I have something to say, but more to share with you not just how little I know, but how many mistakes I've made. And I have this feeling, to be honest with you, that it's a huge thing to share with somebody. Do you know the way in the old days there was, there was confessions. Now, I really, for those who are so young that they mightn't know, this was where, in the Catholic tradition, you went into this little box and you slid over the grill, and there on the other side of the grill was the priest, and you confessed your sins. And in the more recent times, the sins would be based on the idea that, I didn't show love. I didn't show love to Mammy when I stole her chocolate bar out of the fridge, or whatever. I didn't show love to my sister when I hit her on the head with a stone. And that was an attempt to kind of make sense of sin in a world which had decided that there shouldn't be sin, that sin had been a concoction of religion in order to keep people oppressed. Make them all feel guilty, and then they'll all have to come to you for forgiveness. That kind of idea prevailed about Catholicism when I was a young man, and if I went further back, when I was a boy, a child, when sin in the old-fashioned sense was, really a lot of bad things, but mostly sexual, and I was a teenager, I won't go into detail, but suffice it to say that I was in the confession box every Saturday night. I'm not entirely sure whether it was that I was really feeling guilty. I think I liked the intimacy of sharing something very private that I was uneasy about with another human being, with an adult. And even though the priest that used to be in the confession box on a Saturday night at 7 o'clock in Cavan Town, he was a Father McManus, Monsignor McManus. I would say now he's passed on by now, but like he was a big Pudden of a man, and he wasn't controversial in any way. You know, he wasn't kind of aggressive or grumpy or a heavy drinker or this, that or the other. And I think he lived a fairly ordinary but noble life. And so there was nothing intimidating about him. I wasn't afraid of him. And you'd go into this little dark room and you'd slide over the slot. I can still hear the sound of it. And you'd say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." And you go through that ritual. But then you'd throw something in. And even at a young age, you'd find a way to code it, you know. So let's say, for example, there was a particular girl in Loretto that I was terribly fond of now, just for example. And let's say that I had been to a dance with her and we had been physically together, just embracing and slow dancing. This slow dancing was a very, very exciting thing when you were 14 and 15 years of age and you went to these hops. They were like discotheques run in things like, you know, the local youth club. And you'd be there squeezing her, and the intensity of that for a young boy would be huge. And so it would stay with you, the young boy, it would stay with you for days. So you'd be in no doubt that you were obsessed with her. You'd be in no doubt that your obsession was exhausting you, almost physically, to the point that it was difficult to study, to do your homework, or even sometimes to hear the teacher in the class. You would be driven crazy by this longing, this sense of love and the pleasure, the aftertaste of all that intense pleasure you felt in holding her. Now, nowadays you'd say, well, there would be nothing there that was wrong. There was nothing, you know, you'd have to encourage young boys to be young boys and not feel negative or bad, just probably to be a little more mature in respecting women, that'd be all. But to be honest, I kind of knew there was nothing seriously wrong with the fact that I had sexual desires for another human being, but I would still mention it in a coded way. So I'm trying to think back on the exact words that I used to use, and I suppose this was fairly regular on a Saturday night. You'd say something like, I had impure thoughts and I took pleasure in them. That would be, as far as I remember, the way you'd phrase it. And the good man on the other side of the grill, as I say, a big Pudden of a man. I don't know what age he was. To me, he was 150 years old, and he was always the same age. He never asked any questions. I never in my life was asked a question in a confessional box when I was a child. He'd ask it. Sometimes he'd be looking. He'd all the time be looking straight out. He'd never look at the grill. He'd be looking straight out, and you'd imagine that he wasn't listening sometimes. You'd imagine that he was nearly half asleep. And then he would do this blessing. It was called absolution. And I didn't quite understand at that age, like, you know, what is this that's happening? But it was like a nod. It was like a kind of a gesture, the way, again, in those days when we were young and in the country, people used to wave at each other. Like you'd be going along the street in Cavan, and a car would come up maybe with somebody that you knew from school who was maybe 2 or 3 years older, and they had the loan of their father's car, and they'd toot the horn at you, and you would stretch your hand in the air as far as it went and give this huge big signal. You think you were kind of signalling to the pilot of a plane who was taxiing on a runway, right? And it was very effusive kind of gestures you would use. Now, again, it may be true that we used those kind of gestures because we were repressed in other ways, that there was certain aspects of our own sexuality and our way of tending to women, that we were immature and we didn't know how to do it or something, and maybe we overemphasized emotional confidence in other ways, like the big wave. So that is definitely true, and it's in that context that the good Father Pudden would raise his hand and say, absolve you for sins. Amen. And you got the word absolve usually. You usually heard absolve. You knew that was the kind of, that was the fairy liquid in the hot water. That was the power the dishes wouldn't get washed if you didn't have the fairy liquid in it. And that word absolve, you knew that was the thing. But you just felt good. And you'd come out of the confession box and you would go downtown. I would go downtown, I might have a smoke actually on the steps of the cathedral. That was a great habit. Imagine at 14 years of age, 15 years of age, and you'd come out of the cathedral after going to confession. I can't hardly believe this myself when I'm telling it, that we lived like this. But anyway, you'd come out and probably smoke a cigarette. For some reason, we identified that as very manly. Probably men did it a lot when they'd be coming out of the church on a Sunday morning. There was a kind of a subliminal suggestion in it, maybe, that I've just spent far too long in that church listening to that priest say at Mass, give me a cigarette. So the men had come out nearly tapping the cigarette box with the cigarette as they'd be coming out the door, nearly before they'd blessed themselves. That tapping of they used to get the cigarette and tap it. I remember asking my father one time, why would you do that? Because he used to do it standing at the open fire on a winter's evening at 6 o'clock, where he used to drink 2 bottles of Guinness. 2. No more. Never. Just 2. And he would drink them there, and he would take out the cigarette and he would tap it. And I says, why do you tap the cigarette? And he said, there's no need to tap them now, but he said, when I was young, and now he was born in 1903, he said, when I was young, the cigarette wasn't made as well, and the tobacco wasn't as tidy in it as it is now. And so it was just natural to tap it so that it condensed and the cigarette wouldn't go out halfway through it. Now, and there was us. I mean, if he did that in 1920 when he was young, here was me in 1967 or 68, still doing it. Not for a reason except that it was a little pattern, a little social tick, if you like, that had survived down through the century. And you'd have that first cigarette there, and then you'd go down to, I won't say his name, but he was my good friend when I was in secondary school. He lived in the town, and I would knock on his door, and we'd have an old chat, and I would stand there talking to him for about an hour. He wouldn't invite me in. Wasn't a thing you really did in those days. You tended to stand at the door. And we'd stand at the door and be very happy, looking at the sky and looking at the street and sometimes looking at the girls. And sometimes the girl from Loretta that I was very obsessed with would pass on the other side of the street, and I would fall silent. The cigarette butt would fall to the ground, and I would just fall silent, and me jaw dropping, and me mouth open, and me looking at her, and she'd take a glance over at me and say, "Hi. Hi." My heart would nearly tear me ribcage apart with the intensity of its beating and battering. Hi. And of course, there's no doubt that when I went home that night, I would once again have impure thoughts and take pleasure in them. So the cycle of going to confession was integrated into the normality of being social, having sexual desires, having pleasure, having friends, gossiping about the world, and watching who walks down the street. It was part of our ordinary life. And yet I think it did some good. I think that I learned in that process how to confess. The idea that even though I didn't understand it too well, I was going into the dark to meet an adult human being to say, "I'm sorry." And after that, sometimes what we choose to say sorry about can be arbitrary. You know, imagine if you're supposing you're teenagers and you're in a school, and supposing the teacher or the principal makes a law that nobody is allowed eat sweets during class hours. Well, you're breaking a law if you eat a sweet during class hours. But there's no innate natural law that says human beings should not eat sweets during class hours. It's simply something that has been decided, has been defined by the group as, we're not going to do this, there's a prohibition on it, and therefore if you break that prohibition, you're breaking the law, you're acting illegally, or if you want, in theological terms, you're committing a sin. You're not hitting the mark of perfection. You're not being the 100% good, obedient child. You're actually doing a little bit of Lucifer there, a little bit of rebellion, a little bit of, no, I'm not going to serve your law. I'll do what I want myself. And those laws, schools, regulations, youth clubs, they're all laws that are made up arbitrarily. And even bigger laws, like about how you behave emotionally or sexually as an adolescent, they too are, at our time, in the long ago, they were prescribed, and you were told, well, obviously you don't have sex before you're married. But there was all sorts of other prohibitions and other stuff. And the nuns in Loretta were wont to give all sorts of directions to the young ladies in Loretto that we, the boys, were lusting after, and they too would then set limits to our masculine desires and appetites. And later in life I realized that the whole thing of morality is actually culturally defined. The laws we make up as good or bad, the ways we choose this type of sexual behavior is true, is good, is right, this is not. All that, no matter whether you think it's innately, absolutely true, that's your business, but it is culturally defined. And this is really, I suppose I'm coming to the core of what I'd love to share with you today. And that's this. That the way that religion is understood by people who don't practice much, or the way that religion is understood people outside the religion, is very often that it is about judging others. You'll often hear people talking about whether it's Christianity or Islam, that it's always people outside the religion, they give off that religion is judgmental. And obviously it's an accusation that's based on the fact that religions do tend to have an integrated moral code, and sometimes that moral code is not exactly aligned with what society wants to do, and then there's a clash, like, society wants to move on, let's say, about a particular way of behavior, and a religion says, oh no, you can't do that because our moral code says you can't do that. And all that stuff that you hear of, and I don't want to go into the detail of it because I'm not interested in it, but all that detail of morality that religions get blamed for. I have a problem with that. I don't want to go there. I always feel that the best position, when I think of myself as a Christian, or when I think of myself as somebody who practices Buddhism, and I think it would be the same if I were Muslim, but if I was in any way thinking about the health of religion, the first thing I would say to other people is, do what you will. You must do what you will for yourself. And that's what I would say to anybody. If I was religious, if I'm a religious person who prays and whose faith, so what stand do I take? Well, the one I certainly don't go near is to be righteous. To start to impose my law on somebody else, or to say to somebody, because I have found a pathway to peace, and then I see somebody else going on the opposite pathway, so then I should go over to them and say, you're on the wrong path, you're doing wrong. I don't go there. I think that's where sometimes people who are engaged in religion make the mistake. They overemphasize and imagine they have a responsibility to direct everybody else in righteousness, rather than just themselves. And that's where, when I look back on the fact that we used to go to confession, and the fact that confession created in me a habit, an understanding of how normal it is to say sorry. It's not like, it doesn't have to be the end of the world. It doesn't have to be catastrophe. It doesn't have to be that you are taken away by the police in chains. All that doesn't have to happen before you say sorry. You can say sorry even if it's not a big deal. Like you're standing there and you feel bad about something, but it's not a big deal. You could easily ignore it and just get on with your life. But it's also very, very healing to apologize, to say sorry. And there's something about it is a beautiful way to live as well, in faith. The sense release yourself from the idea of perfection. Release yourself from the idea that you are doing right, that you are the righteous. Like, that's an awful burden, really. To be righteous, to be hitting the mark perfectly all the time. And I think that it damages your sense of, just your sense of yourself. It damages it makes you brittle or something when you think you're right. So that's what confession did for me when I was a teenager. It allowed me to practice the idea of guilt and the fact that I wasn't perfect and the fact that I constantly had to try and fail and then say sorry. Try, fail, and say sorry. And that, it kind of runs against everything that is said to young people nowadays, because now there's a feeling that the kind of things that I'm saying that came from religion, there's a sense that they damaged young people, that they made them inhibited, they made them feel bad. And then the need now is to affirm people, to say that everything you're doing is right. And I think that the more you affirm young people, the more delicate they get, actually. It doesn't release them. It's a terrible burden to think that you are right all the time for a young person. And the irony is that affirming it is keeping the burden on them. So I think that it's okay to be wrong, and it's okay. You can give yourself permission to be wrong, to have let somebody down is okay. You can forgive yourself. And when you don't forgive yourself, it's again another sign that there's a part of you trying to be righteous, trying to beat yourself up because you didn't do what you should have done. You forgot to send a birthday card, or you forgot to get a present, or you neglected somebody, which is wrong. Well, it's wrong in the sense that it's not perfection, you know what I mean? You didn't show love when you forgot to get a birthday present for your beloved or something. It's not good. But it's harder if you try and think that you're perfect all the time, because then you'll have to excuse all these things. You'll have to sort of rationalize everything. And people do that. And I think that's why so many people end up kind of neurotic. They're kind of exhausted trying to rationalize their own perfection, rather than surrender and say, I'm guilty. I don't do things well. I remember one time I was being interviewed on the radio. Oh, it's a long time ago. Carrie Crowley, that wonderful radio presenter, was interviewing me for a Sunday morning programme, and I spent the whole half hour talking about how I was wrong and how I had failed. And, she was kind of setting out the interview like, all the things I had succeeded at, or all the things I was interested in, interesting things I had done. But I kind of kept coming back to her and saying, I failed as a priest. There's no point in me pontificating about the church. I failed. And I failed as a writer. I mean, at the time I had published some books, but then there was about 10 years where I published nothing because nobody would publish me. And what could you say? But sure, I have failed. And I knew what it was to send away manuscripts to publishers and have them sent back with that rejection slip of about 3 lines. Thank you for showing us your work. Unfortunately, it's not suited to our publishing house or whatever. And I felt that there was so many things I failed at. When I think about myself as a parent or as a lover or as a partner or as a husband, I could easily say, well, these are things that I failed at. I haven't hit the mark. I'm not perfect. And I suppose I certainly wouldn't want to have the burden of being perfect. And that's why I'm hugely grateful for the tradition that I was brought up in of going to confession. And I have not been to a Christian or a Catholic confession box for decades. And I certainly lost interest in it as having any kind of effect on me, because the language of the whole Catholic thing became so archaic to the world as it changed and as I absorbed all the experiences of living in a modern world and living a modern life. But the funny thing is that I still retained this sense of, if you like, guilt, but I would say more lack of perfection, a sense of failure, and the sense of it being okay to confess it. So if I don't use a ritual in the church, I'm using other people. I find it possible to say sorry to other people and to ask their forgiveness. And when I am alone and I reflect on the things that I have failed to do myself, like maybe get up early and work hard and or just be more rigorous in the work that I do, and then I fail, and then I'm lazy, and then I waste 2 or 3 days and I'm doing nothing except looking at the sea or wandering around the roads, and then there's a book that I'm supposed to read and I don't read it, And if I had no way out of that, I would get very neurotic and negative about. I'd have to rationalise why I didn't read the book. So I'm supposed to read a good book in psychology that I got from a person, and it's a really good book. Should read it. Now, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, haven't read it. So one strategy is to rationalise that, because I do nothing wrong. Therefore, I didn't read it because I had too many other things to do. And that's where you start blaming other people. You start saying things like, well, I didn't read it because you asked me to do the garden and I was too busy doing the garden to read it. You see? In fact, when I say to myself, number one, I didn't read it because I was too lazy. But I don't feel burdened by that guilt. I feel forgiven. I feel it's okay. There's part of me inside me that forgives me, myself. It's okay to fail. And now here's the real interesting thing. In my life, everything I've learned has been through failure. Everything I've learned. I mean, I can't even begin to express what I mean, but I know that you understand. I know that you know it yourself in your own life, that everything comes through failure. Oh, success is just gripping things tighter and tighter and tighter. And failure is like letting go of things. It's like opening your hands, loosening the muscles of your paw. You feel empty, you feel naked, you feel failure is like a strange place of release. It's a strange place of, if you like, surrender. When you're right all the time, when your righteousness is strong, it's like a clenched fist. And it's amazing the amount of images you'll get through history of people who were righteous, people who were good and righteous, and you'll always see them as, kind of clench-fisted and warrior-like, and like, the chin up and out, and like, I am right. What you might call heroic. Failure is about the bowed head, the head bowed. That's the image we have in history. The bowed head of the poor person who is a failure, who is ashamed. And yet I'd have to say that in my life, it has always been in those moments that I have developed insight or some kind of deeper understanding of life. When you actually fail. So all you need then in this, I suppose, process of failure is somewhere to go where you can acknowledge it. A lot of people now go to the therapist, and there's definitely a sense that you go to a therapist with the burden and the bundle of anxiety and neurosis that you're carrying for years, and you go to the therapist and she or he listens, and you speak and you share and you begin to unburden yourself. And in a great amount of cases, that process is about sharing your guilt, how you feel, you have failed. And in some sense, whatever the therapist does, and there may be different strategies and different levels of affirmation and non-directive work that the therapist will do with you, but whatever they do, the one thing that is the same always is here you are in front of another person trying to share your failure, or what you think is your failure. And the process of engaging with somebody else releases you. It's good to tell somebody. Go tell the bees, they used to say. If you've nobody to tell your deepest secrets to, tell them to the bees. You must tell somebody. I think telling them to the bees is close to where I am in relation to faith, because, the sense of God's presence allows you to recognize the bees and the trees and all the sentient life as in some way the face of God. In some way, the kind of fluttering of a presence that is beyond you, to whom it makes sense if you relate to them as you. If you go to the universe through the beautiful nature, the natural environment we live in, and if you go and find a personal energy out there, you don't even have to speak. You just have to be silent and listen. And if you feel burdened in your heart by failure, you just bring those things to the surface and you say, Lord, I have failed. I have failed here, there and yonder. And you don't have to be told anything. You will feel it in your heart. The universe embracing you and letting you free and releasing you and blessing you and absolving you. And so that to me is how powerful and beautiful it is to work through the process of feeling guilt, of feeling where you have failed, and then feeling forgiveness, knowing there is forgiveness, confident that there is forgiveness. but it's just different from actually denying that you ever do anything wrong. And it is a scary thing when, as our society does now, we teach our children sometimes that they can do no wrong. One of the most moving people I ever met was a woman called Alice, and she lived in Glangevlin around 1973, 74, 75, and I was there at the same time. And she's one of the people to whom I wrote a letter in the past 2 years. Now, she's long dead, but the book that's coming out in October, All the Things Left Unsaid, is a collection of letters that I wrote over the past year. And I wrote them to people I loved and to people I felt I had let them down. People I had done something in a sense that I felt bad about. Mostly out of neglect. And so, if you've let somebody down, you can make amends while they're still alive, but when they're gone, you can never talk to them again. You can never speak to them again. And I am really haunted sometimes by people who were living with me and are now passed away. I mean, it actually centered around my own marriage, because myself and the beloved were married by a wonderful priest, Father Pat O'Brien, so many years ago, 1993. And the best man at the wedding was Tom Hickey, the actor, Benji in the O'Riordans, long ago. And the best woman, I think that's the name you'd give her, was Mary McPartland, a wonderful singer from Leitrim, lived in Galway, and she sang all night with a couple of other musicians in a house. We had a wedding and a house party. We didn't have the money for a hotel. We just went to a house and had a party. And one of my dear friends, the first fella to come in the door, to darken the door of the church that morning of the wedding, was a man who I love dearly. That was Bernard Loughlin. He used to run Anna McCarrick, the Tyrone Guthrie Centre. And it was a strange thing that they all died within a year of each other. And that's what got me going about the idea. I couldn't, so many things I would still love to say to those people as dear friends, and I can't. And so many ways that I let them down. And I thought it would be lovely to write a letter, one to each of them, and to make a book out of it. And I've been doing that for the past year. And it has taught me this deep sense of how it's okay to say sorry. It's okay to acknowledge that you've made a mistake. It's okay to have failed and to confess. In fact, it's a liberation. You begin to sense a deeper self within you when you take that path. I think it must be a very, very wise practice. And I think that because the institutional Christian religion is such a rickety thing at the moment and very ineffective, it may not be reaching people, and it may be that we are living more and more, one generation after another now, more and more secular. And we may be missing out on things. And that's one of them. The healthy and healing dynamic of confessing what you've done wrong, what ways that you have neglected somebody, accepting it. Not judgmentally that you're a bad person, but just accepting that you have failed. You failed to make the dinner right. Well, you don't feel bad about it, but you still know you've not done it right. You try to fix the car and you lift up the bonnet and you spend an hour at that and the car still doesn't work. So you know you failed. You tried to fix the car, you failed. But you don't feel neurotic about it. You don't feel like, oh, I'm terrible because I failed. No, you say, well, it just didn't work. I failed. But when it comes to moral issues, we have this strange way that we want to kind of be perfect. And therefore we feel threatened if anybody says, well, you did wrong there. Morally, you did something wrong. We feel really, oh, no, I'm always right. I'm always perfect. And that sense of always being perfect becomes the burden. And I think it wears people out, and I think that sometimes people go to the therapist for that very reason. They're exhausted. So one of the people that I wanted to write about or write to was Alice. And Alice, I don't know what age she was when she lived in Glengevlin, but she lived in a broken down house, and eventually the roof fell in and she had no house at all. And she had one cow. And the local priest said that she could put the cow in the byre of the priest's house and she could stay in a little room off the kitchen in the presbytery. She was delighted to have somewhere to put the cow, but she didn't want to come into the house, and so she slept in the byre with the cow. And the cow was precious to her, and she treated it like a pet. Now, she had no land, so she used to have to bring the cow along the ditch, along the road, all day long. And all day long, the two of them kept each other company. And she had a pet name for the cow. The cow was called Rabbit. And I always wondered, like, that was a strange name. Why would you call a cow Rabbit? I mean, you might say, why would you call a cow anything but a cow? Okay, so you have the cow as a pet, so you need a pet name. What would possess you to call it Rabbit? It's very confusing. Alice says to somebody, where's me rabbit? And they'll go look for a rabbit. And then she says, oh, there he is, or there she is. And they see a cow. You know, but somebody gave me a theory on this. They said that when Alice was young, rabbits were very plentiful. People would eat them, but they would also use them for pets. You know, you might have a rabbit that got a little damage done to its foot or something, and you'd be able to feed it and nurse it and keep it in some way. And you could make a pet out of a brown rabbit. I've seen them. So, supposing she had a pet rabbit when she was a little girl, there's a tendency that if you have an animal as a pet and you give it a name when you're very young, there's a tendency that you'll always want that particular animal and that you'll rename. You'll use the same name again. This has happened to me. This has happened, many people I know. So as a child, somebody has a cat called Charlie. And they love this cat. And then 50 years later, after half a dozen cats, there they are with a little kitten, and you say, what's the name of the cat? And they say, Charlie. Charlie is always the cat. And there's a lovely sense in that. I always think it's like reincarnation, that there's some continuum of Charlie-ness that lasts from one cat to the next, as if that there was a presence out there that was expressing itself in Charlie, and that when Charlie the first passed away, the presence, the kind of mystical presence of Charliness, moved into the second cat and the third. And this is very, very plausible. It's like a Platonic idea. It's like a kind of an idea that Plato would have had about ideas, that there is an essence to everything. And it's also very close to my own enthusiasm for faith and religion, because it's like the essence would only be part of the one complete essence of all being, and therefore it is that one being underneath everything that holds the universe together, that keeps us awake in our conscious mind, and it is that in the cat that I am meeting. In all sentient beings, I'm meeting this same sense of otherness, this beautiful sense of the one that I reach out to love. Little cat, little dog, whatever you like. But for Alice, in 1972-73, on the roads of Glengevlin, lying sitting on the ditch, it was a cow called Rabbit. And it is possible that the tenderness that she experienced with the rabbit as a child is what stayed with her. And when she then, in the later years of her life, had this precious cow that she loved, what else would she call her but Rabbit? Well, there she would be, sitting on the ditch on a sunny afternoon, maybe in the start of September. And I'd be returned to school. So, like, I was teaching at the time. I was a school teacher, teaching in Lockett House down in Blacklion. And I was living in Glengevlin. And sometimes I was staying with the priest in the same house. And that's how I got to meet Alice. And so I'd be driving home. I had a new Ford Escort at the time. Flashy car. It was an orange car with black trimming on it. It was very kind of loud. And it was XID 407 was the number plate. And I loved it dearly. And Alice loved her cow. And I'd see her on the side of the road as I'd be coming up towards the gate of the priest's house, and I would stop and I'd pull in and I'd wind down the window and we'd have a wee chat. And we'd be chatting away like that, and Alice had only, she could only see in one eye because the other eye, there was big cataracts on it. And in those days, there wasn't much, I tell you. Like, I had cataracts during the year and I got rid of them, but in those days you lived with them. Maybe for the rest of your life, and that was Alice. And you could see the eye was white. One of her eyes was just a blank white. And you'd get out of the car. She had long grey hair, silver hair now, white hair I should say, silvery, good big tuft of hair, and she had a lovely round face. She was an old woman, but she was a very sensual kind of old woman, and sometimes when she'd laugh, she'd put the flat of her hand up at her eyes. She'd bury her face in her hand, laughing. And she used to always laugh when she saw me. There was something comical she saw in me. I don't know what it was. And she'd call me Hairy Harding because of the beard. And I'd get out and I'd light a cigarette, because I was still smoking even then. And I'd sit on the ditch beside her. And I would ask her how she was and how the cow was. And she'd tell you all that. And then sometimes, if she was upset about something, she'd tell you. She might have had a row with somebody. She might have gone into some shop during the day looking for something and she didn't have the money. And maybe she got turned away. And she'd tell you this. And she'd cry. And she'd be upset. And I used to listen to her like that. And then there were times, because she was an old woman who lived on the side of the road and kind of was in a different universe than my universe. She wasn't educated. I don't think she could read. I'm not sure. But she certainly couldn't see. And the only one she talked to was the cow. So she never told any stories on anybody. So I'd be sitting there and I could tell her if something went wrong in my teaching, or if I had a failure in my life, I could actually share it with her. And I wouldn't be sharing it like formally, not confessing anything. But she'd say, "Did you have a good day, Master?" Because she used to call me Master Harding. And then behind me back she'd say, "Harry Harding." The children would be going the road, and they'd stop her, and they'd say, "Well, Alice, how are you?" And she'd say, "Great." She'd say, "Did you see Harry Harding today?" But to me, she'd be there listening, and I'd be telling her things that didn't go well for me, things I was worried about. Complicated things sometimes that I used to be aware she didn't understand what I was talking about really. Might be some hugely complicated thing to do with my mother and how I felt about her and how my mother was, acting up negatively towards me and all the rest of it. And I would share this with Alice in a kind of a coded way, because I was used to talking in code when I'd be in these situations. I got that from that long ago confessional. And so I'd be able to kind of in some way articulate my failures in life, sitting on the ditch talking to a homeless woman who had a pet cow called Rabbit. And she'd usually put her big fat hand over her two eyes, no matter what I told her, and she'd start laughing. And that to me was like the big Pudden of a priest who used to move his hand up and down when he'd be saying the words, "I absolve you." And in exactly the same way as he absolved me, I would hear Alice's laugh and see her hand going up to her eyes and her head bending over and her rocking with a little laughter sitting on the ditch. And I would feel forgiven. I would feel absolved. And I would go on with the rest of my day then. I'd wish her luck and well. And I'd still be in houses all over the mountain in those days when I was 21 and 22 years of age. And I'd still be lusting after young women and wanting to be dancing with them and wanting to be doing all sorts of other things. And I had a great life. And Alice was part of that life. More part of it and more significant in it than I had ever realized. She was like a priest. She was like the one who was a therapist to me, who listened and then absolved me. Just by her laughter, I felt lightened. And so I continued this mystery of finding liberation in your own failures, confessing your own guilt, letting it go, telling it to somebody, even if it's the bees. Tell it out, speak it out. Don't be afraid. You will feel forgiven if you've the courage to share. Don't carry your unease or your guilt. Don't carry it inside and then pretend there is no such thing as guilt. It will wear you down. It'll go like lead down through your body until you're exhausted and you have to go endlessly to a therapist to try and unravel you. That was Alice. The priest said she was an angel one day. He said it regularly. He used to say he'd be sitting beside her on the sofa in the back kitchen of the parochial house. She'd come in and we'd make her tea and have a chat with her, and she'd laugh at there was a range in the kitchen. It was an oil-fired range, but it was nonetheless a range. It always smelt of oil. It was one of those that has a wick inside it, so there wasn't a machine turning it on and off. It was just 24/7. It slowly, quietly burned away and kept the whole house warm, and particularly the kitchen. And she'd be there, and the priest would be there, and he'd say, "Alice," he'd say, "you're an angel." And she'd put the hand up to her eyes, and she'd bend over, laughing. And sometimes, as she bent over, he had noticed that the laughter had turned to tears. And the priest would say, "Alice, why are you crying?" And she'd say, "You're very good to me." She'd say it through the tears, "You're very good to me." And she was like crying because somebody was kind to her. And that used to tell me the depth of the hardships that she had fallen into since the time that she was a child, playing with rabbits. Thank you for being here, for listening to my confessions. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I really do feel grateful for you being here. I enjoy your company. So be well. Bye-bye.